Welcome to the second video on the March of the 10,000, and we're going to continue right where we left off in the last video. And that involved the truce between the Persians and the Greeks. The Persians promised to provide the Greeks supplies and provisions as long as they didn't loot their way out of Persia. And of course the Persians would provide an escort for the Greeks to make sure they didn't cause any trouble. And so the Greeks initially had followed the Euphrates River down into Mesopotamia, and now they would follow the Tigris River out of Mesopotamia, of course under escort by the Persians. Now these of course are the two great rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates right here, that formed ancient Mesopotamia. And of course that is the cradle of civilization. And so the Persians and the Greeks started moving up the Tigris River out of Mesopotamia, and they reached the Zapatis River, which you can see right here on the map. Now Xenophon will relate that all of these brawls took place between the Persians and the Greeks, and so there were a lot of feelings of mistrust and suspicions on both sides. And so Clearchus and Tisipherne decided to meet to see if they could hammer out a resolution. After that, Tisipherne invited Clearchus to dinner, and Clearchus accepted, despite the concerns of several other Greek generals. And as it turned out, this was a trap. Tisipherne had all of the Greek generals seized and arrested that were inside his tent. All of the Greek officers and soldiers that were outside the tent were killed. Now from their camp, the Greeks looked on in amazement about what was going on in the Persian camp. They could see all these horses galloping around, and they wondered what on earth was going on. It wouldn't take long before they found out the awful truth. One of the Greek soldiers, although mortally wounded, made it back to the Greek camp to warn them about what had transpired at the Persian camp, and the Greeks rushed to collect all of their arms, expecting a Persian attack at any moment. But the Persians failed to appear. Instead, they sent 3 messengers to the Greek camp to announce what had happened to the Greek generals. Clearchus apparently had been convicted of treason, and he and several of the other generals were beheaded at Susa in front of the great king, Artaxerxes. They then ordered the Greeks to lay down their arms and surrender, and the Persians promised that a few of the generals had actually survived and were alive, and as long as they laid down their arms, they could meet up with these 2 Greek generals. But by now, the Greeks, of course, were very suspicious of anything the Persians said, and so they asked the Persians to produce any Greek leaders that were alive. And with that, the Persians stood there for a while and then went away without saying a word. And so it was obvious now that the truce was in fact over. And so it's almost hard to imagine, but the Greeks were actually in a worse position than they were earlier. Now most of their leaders were dead. They were still 1,500 miles away from the Black Sea, and they had no provisions or even a clear line of retreat. And so things looked very bad for the Greeks indeed. Now, why did Artaxerxes go back on his word? Why did he have most of the Greek leaders executed? And I think we can come to some understanding in examining Artaxerxes' mindset in this situation. Now, I think initially Artaxerxes just wanted the Greeks out of Persia. And so that was the main reason he signed the initial treaty, was simply to get the Greeks out of Persia. But I think eventually he began to change his mind. And the reason had to do with perception. If he allowed this tiny little Greek force to exit Persia without being destroyed, that would look bad on Persia. I mean, Persia reportedly had this huge empire that had millions of inhabitants. And here this tiny little Greek force was able to escape the mighty Persian Empire, especially when they were 1,500 miles away from Greek territory. And so that's why I think Artaxerxes changed his mind and decided to destroy the Greeks. Now he hoped by executing Clearchus and several of the other Greek leaders that he might get the Greeks to lay down their arms. But as we know now, the Greeks simply refused to lay down their arms, and that probably was a very wise decision because they probably would have all ended up in some slave mine somewhere. Now the next morning, Xenophon gave a rousing speech, and he appealed to the Greek sense of honor and valor. And if you ever want to get an ancient Greek fired up, all you have to do is appeal to their sense of honor. And Xenophon basically stated that it was pointless to sit around and despair over the current situation. If they were going to die, they were going to die on their own terms. And that meant starting an almost impossible retreat to the Black Sea, even though all of the circumstances had worked against them so far. And the rest of the Greeks to the man agreed to this, and so they elected new leaders. Xenophon was one of the men elected as a general, as well as a Spartan. Now Xenophon was placed in command of the rear guard, and the newly elected Spartan general was placed in charge of the frontal units. Now, how about that? A Spartan and an Athenian working together to get out of this emergency situation. It just goes to show you that whenever there was a crisis, Spartans and Athenians could sometimes work together. And so that was the situation. The Greeks would rather die gloriously in battle rather than wait around and fall helplessly into the hands of the enemies. And so the Greeks crossed the river Zapatas and began marching in regular order. Now, almost immediately, the Persians started attacking the rear guard of the Greek formation. And these were essentially horse archers and slingers. And Xenophon relates that they would gallop up and start shooting their bows and arrows. And although the Greeks had archers, their bows had a shorter range than the Persians. And so the only thing Xenophon could do was order the Greeks to charge these cavalry formations. But the Persians would quickly retreat with almost no casualties. And so it was obvious the Persians were trying to wear down the Greeks through a war of attrition. Xenophon does relate that they did finally reach some villages which provided provisions for the Greeks. Now, one thing Xenophon relates is that the Greeks decided to always camp in the first village that they found because there might not be another for dozens and dozens of miles. And often the difference between life and death was determined by the discovery of a village or town that could provide life-saving provisions. Now, eventually the Greeks made it to a town called Larissa, which you can see right here on the map. But this was a city that had long been deserted, and it was originally inhabited by the Medes. You will remember that the Medes were conquered by the Persians centuries earlier. And Xenophon relates that it was quite an amazing city. In fact, he talks about one area of the city that contained a stone pyramid. Now, after Larissa, the Greeks marched to yet another deserted fortress, and that was a city called Mespila, which you can see on the map right here. And again, this had been a city that the Medes once inhabited. Xenophon relates an interesting story that after the Medes had been conquered by the Persians, the king's wife originally sought refuge in this city. Now, after leaving this city, Tisipherne made another appearance, and so he continued to shadow the Greeks wherever they went, but he refused to offer up a major battle. Now, the Greeks figured out an interesting tactic on how to lose the Persians. The Greeks began to notice that the Persians never operated at night, and that they always camped around 7 miles away from the Greek camp. Now, sometimes the Persians would pause and sort of glare at the Greeks before they retired for the night, but when they finally did retire for the night, as I mentioned, they were around 7 to 8 miles away from the Greek camp. Now, the Greeks would feign that they were about to camp as well, but once the Persians were out of sight and once the Persians had camped around 8 miles away, the Greeks would steal a march, as the saying goes, and march another 8 miles without the Persians being aware of this. And so it would be several days before the Greeks saw the Persians again because of these forced nighttime marches. But at least they gave the Greeks a little bit of breathing space from Tisipherne's army. Now, from here, the Greeks entered the territory of the Cardassians. Now, the Cardassians were a fierce mountain tribe. In fact, they were so fierce that the Persians didn't even bother attempting to conquer this territory. And so you can see what the Greeks were up against entering this territory. Now, the Cardassians are believed to be the ancestors of the Kurds. And yes, those same Kurds that are fighting ISIS in northern Iraq today. Now, the Greeks were attempting to reach Armenia. And in order to reach Armenia, they had to force a passage through the territory of the Cardassians. Now, the Persians decided to break off their pursuit of the Greeks, realizing that they didn't want to enter the territory of the Cardassians because they knew exactly how difficult that would be. Now, predictably, the Cardassians resisted the Greeks every step of the way. Every time the Greeks entered a mountain pass, the Cardassians would lob down volleys of arrows and sling stones. And so the Greeks made little progress through these mountains because of the fierce reaction by the Cardassians. Xenophon would relate that the Greeks suffered more casualties in these mountains than they did against the Persians. Now, after about a week of this, the Greeks finally reached the Teleboas River. And that was a river that connected the land of Armenia to the country of the Cardassians. But the Greeks found themselves in a rather difficult spot, because the Cardassians were still pursuing the Greeks. And so this made the river crossing very, very dangerous, because the Cardassians were still behind the Greeks, and the Greeks didn't know what was on the other side of the Armenian River. So again, it was very, very dangerous. Now, what Xenophon decided to do here was to leave a rear guard to deal with the Cardassians, and then the rest of the detachments would cross across the river. And this tactic worked, and the Greeks were able to cross the river rather easily. And so they entered Armenia, which was a land of rugged mountains and extinct volcanoes. Now, eventually the Greeks ran into the Persian satrap Anabasis, and Armenia was part of his territory. Now, Anabasis offered to meet with the Greeks rather than launching an assault. And eventually they decided on a treaty, and it was very similar to the earlier one that the Great King had offered the Greeks. If the Greeks agreed not to pillage Armenia, Anabasis would provide food and water for the Greeks. And so with the agreement in place, the Greeks marched deeper into Armenia, and they ran into their first heavy snowfalls. And so you can see all the different extremes the Greeks had to go through during their march to the Black Sea. Now, the farther and farther the Greeks moved away from Cardassian territory, more and more villages started to prop up, and some of these villages turned out to be quite friendly, and provided corn and wine and grapes to the hungry Greeks. But still, the heavy snow slowed the Greek march to almost a standstill, and that was because it was very difficult to move the pack mules through this treacherous snow. Now, Xenophon relates that stragglers reported seeing watchfires in the distance, and soon the Greeks learned that these were Persian watchfires, and so the Persians yet again were shadowing the Greeks, and the Greeks further learned that Anabasis was planning to launch an all-out assault against the Greeks. The Greeks, however, had no choice but to continue along with their march to reach the Black Sea as quickly as possible. But the march was getting more and more difficult because of the snow. At one point, Xenophon relates that there was 6 feet of snow. In fact, it was so difficult that only fires could melt this snow. And so many Greeks were dying from frostbite rather than any fighting that was going on. Now, it was the stragglers who were very vulnerable because the Persians had created patrols, and these patrols would pick off any stragglers that fell behind. And so Xenophon had to constantly keep pushing his men to keep moving on to avoid these Persian patrols. Now, eventually, the Greeks decided to launch a surprise attack against Anabasis, and it was successful in that the Greeks never saw the Persians again on this march. Now, eventually, the Greeks reached the river Phasis, and beyond this river were yet again more mountains and more hostile tribes, and so it was a continuous, ongoing fight for the Greeks. And several of these mountains had fortresses, which in some cases the Greeks had to take because they were simply out of provisions. Now, the Greeks did run into one local chieftain who offered provisions, but it didn't take long before the Greeks realized that this local chieftain wanted them to fight his own private little war. And so this must have been quite appalling to the Greeks. I mean, here they've marched thousands of miles, and now they have to go fight a war in order to gain new provisions. In any event, the Greeks eventually pushed on. Now, eventually they reached a mountain called Thekes, which you can see right here on the map. And when they reached this, Xenophon heard all of these shouts in the distance, and the Greeks were shouting, "The sea, the sea!" And those are very famous words, by the way, in ancient Greek history. The sea, because they could finally see Greek territory. And unbelievably, we're in the final stage of one of the most difficult marches in military history. Now, eventually they made it to the Greek city of Trapezus, and so here they finally entered into Greek territory, and here they were supplied with crucial provisions. The Greeks also held an elaborate feast in celebration of their victory, and they also decided to slaughter a number of cattle in thanks to Zeus himself, as Xenophon would call him, Zeus the Savior. Now, if you can believe this, many of these Greeks would sign up for another campaign in Asia Minor, and we will get to that in the next video. But before we go, I'd like to talk about the legacy of the March of the 10,000 and its impact on Greek history. And the very thing that Artaxerxes worried about happened. This march removed this idea or this notion of Persian invincibility. And it certainly weakened the Persians in the eyes of the ancient world, especially in Greece. And it set the stage for future invasions of Persia, and most notably, of course, the campaigns of Alexander the Great, who is probably using Xenophon's account of the March of the 10,000 as his own personal playbook. And in fact, he followed many of the same routes that the March of the 10,000 took. Okay, that's going to wrap it up for this video. See you guys in the next video.